looks good. Thank you all very much for being here. There we go. Perfect. Okay. First, we wanted to try a little get to know people, just to get a feel for what the current experience is for the people who are attending and what they're looking at doing in the near future. So could people in the stream or people in the room raise your hand if you are currently involved in a migration? Okay, we've got 3 in the room. Okay, so we've got a mix of, how about are going to be doing a migration in the near future? Okay, got another group? Lots, yes, okay, excellent. The people who are migrating, are you moving from Islandora 7 or from another platform? Islandora 7, I guess.
Islandora 7.
Yes. Anybody coming from anything else? Nobody here. Okay, excellent.
Oh, Luna.
Luna. Okay, and just one last question. I'll skip the one get to know, but who will be performing the migration for you? How many are doing it within the institution? Raise your hands. Okay, handful. Okay, cool. How many are working or planning on working with a vendor? Okay, handful here.
5.
Okay, good. So we've got a mix of everybody, and that's sort of what we wanted to know. If suddenly everybody was moving from Omeka, then we would very quickly change our presentation. Turn it back to Dara. We'll be switching back and forth, Dara and I, through the rest of the presentation.
So before you start your project, there are many things you need to think about, but we sort of called out a few here. What features does your site have now that you absolutely need to carry over into Islandora 2.0? Because you want to think about what Islandora 2.0 has already. Maybe there are maybe there's something that you really need. And if you're having a vendor or you're doing it internally, maybe you have the time or budget that you can spend on a one big feature that you really feel like you need when you migrate. And think about who your stakeholders are and what they need, and not just stakeholders in your area of use, but think about administrative, content creators, metadata librarians, and the users outside of your organization.
There we go. Yes, so one of the most important things to keep in mind, and that's sort of going to drive what we're talking about today, is where your data is coming from for the migration. Do you have Islandora 7 and you are working with your mods XML data streams? Are you coming from either an Islandora site or another site where you have spreadsheets that are outside of Islandora, where you have been keeping the metadata of record and you want to migrate from those? Or, as we mentioned earlier, are you coming from a non-Islandora platform? And then in that case, what sort of format can you get your metadata or your objects out in? Is it just going to be working with spreadsheets, or is there something more complex that's going to be going on? So what we're going to talk about today are 2 workflows that exist right now. One that is out as a part of the main Islandora stream, Islandora Workbench. And then I'm going to be talking a little bit about something that Discovery Garden offers, just to give another option of what's going on, and that's a Foxmo migration. I keep forgetting. Workbench, switching to Dara.
So Workbench is what we at Born Digital use for the migrations. And I have the link to the GitHub repo here in the slides. It's a command line tool for importing content from a CSV, and it's very well documented. There's a lot of documentation in GitHub always being updated, new features, new functionality being added all the time. So it's a good tool to use, we found. So you get your metadata into spreadsheets, and then the data in the spreadsheet, each line points to an object. You can migrate complex taxonomies with Workbench now. You have to do that separately before you do the objects, but it does handle taxonomies that are hierarchical or that have authority URIs associated with them. And Workbench also allows bulk editing and deleting.
And a little information about Foxmal migration. Like I mentioned, this is a specific Discovery Garden offering, but what it does differently from Workbench is that it's pulling the data, the objects and the metadata directly from the Fedora objects in Islandora 7. So it's pulling the digital files from the OBJ data stream, the collection compound relationships from the RelsExt, and then the metadata directly from the mods XML data stream. Hold on. There we go. Okay, so no matter which method you were doing or an entirely bespoke method that your institution might be working with, one of the important first steps is doing a data survey, finding out what sort of form your data currently is in. And there's a few top level questions you can ask when beginning that. You know, what metadata schema you're using. If you're coming from Islandora 7, that is probably mods, but have you extended mods in any way? Have you customized it in any way? Are there controlled vocabularies or authorities that you're using? You know, what the fields you're currently using are. And then if you have a standardized metadata application profile defining your fields, or if you're a consortial institution, and so you have standards that you're sharing with other institutions. All of these things help define at a first level what you have now and then what you want to try to reproduce in the new system. But the other question that you need to take in mind at this point is what's the reality of your metadata? Not just what you had planned to do or hoped you were doing, but what's the reality once you start taking a look at it? And one of the things that I suggest and use for this is doing a mods XPath analysis. And I'm mentioning just a couple of tools here. It's basically taking all of your mods data streams down and then processing them offline to find out exactly what the XPaths, the XML structure is in the data as you have it now. In order to do this, you need to be able to download your mods data streams, and the Islandora data stream CRUD module is a very good, useful tool for doing that through the command line. And then there are some existing shared scripts out there. I like to use the ones that are part of Louisiana State University shares a XML to CSV group of scripts. I just use the first two, not trying to take it all the way to the CSV. But there are two that will basically, well, I'll show this in a second, but basically combine all your metadata into a single XML file and then analyze it for all the XPaths. And then I'm also linking there, although I'm not going to show any details about them because I have a little trouble with them. There are some Ruby scripts for manipulating mods that will take, again, a look at all your files and do the same sort of analysis and give you a report, and also let you take a look, give some export reports of what the fields are actually in there. And again, linking to all these resources in the slides, which are shared. I'm sorry, I keep hitting the wrong keyboard. Okay, so this is just a little visualization of what the first two scripts in the XML to CSV do for me. Starting on the left with a folder of XML files. These are just the sample files that come with the scripts. And then these combine them all into one giant XML file with a mods collection wrapper and then individual mods wrappers around the XML from each file. And then the script also adds an identifier field with the PID from the file name, so that you can then connect to the individual files that you're looking for. And then on the right of the image is the first draft of the giant XPath list that it will give you. If you see it, it really gives you everything. So if you have one XML file where the attributes are in a different order than they are in others, that's a separate XPath. But it's something that you can go through. I just do a lot of find and replace in BBEdit, and then using the tools in BBEdit to remove duplicates and so forth, and you can get it down to exactly what you're dealing with. And one of the reasons, the other way of doing this sort of analysis is with looking at your solar fields. Again, for this, you need access to your solar. You need to be able to run solar queries. But at the bottom of the slide is the template for a solar query you can do, which will export all the headers from all of your solar fields in the collection. And then again, you can take that into a spreadsheet and then go through and delete all but this, the string fields, the _MS and _S. And then that can give you a list of how solar is looking at all of the fields in your data. And all of these things help you find the outliers, the weird bits of XML that have gotten rid into the system because you changed your XML form, or you imported something that didn't quite follow the standards. And that's what I'm talking about here. You really don't want to make assumptions about what you've got. You know, standards are pretty to look at in a PDF and to agree at in a committee meeting, but they aren't necessarily the reality once you get into your collection. Like I mentioned, changing XML forms, batch importing and having, you know, something different about the script one time to another. You know, if you have partners, unless you are checking each one as you are importing it, there's a lot of interesting things that can get in there. And the errors just creep in over time. So we've done that. One of the things that you want to think about early in the process, in the project planning phase, is, are you going to want to do any data interventions as a part of this migration? Because you want to plan for that in your schedule. You know, are there things that you have been doing that aren't in standards that you want to fix before you migrate them into a new system? Are there fields that you've always wanted to use, but you didn't set up in Islandora 7, so you want to set them up, even if you aren't necessarily moving metadata into them? You know, is there data in there that was for a very specific purpose in 5 years ago, but now serves no purpose, and so you want to ignore it? But again, this can often be icing on the cake. It is not necessarily the goal of your migration. So it's something that if you think you want to do, you should put time in your schedule in order to do it. Okay, and Dara will start talking about preparing your metadata.
So once you have dumped out your metadata and you have it all in front of you, it's time to map it into Islandora 2.0 / Drupal. So what you want to do is, and Chris talked about this, think about what fields you want to display. What fields do your users, your front-end users need? Do you have fields that you want just to be visible to admin logged in users? What do you want the fields to be called? What do you want the labels to be? And most importantly, what type of field do you need? Do you need it to be a taxonomy? Do you need it to be filterable, facetable? Does it need to be a link? Is it a geographic coordinate? So these are all things to think about as you're mapping your data. When you're thinking about what fields you want to display, if you're coming from mods, you have to look at how your XML-based fields with subelements and attributes transfer into Drupal? Do you need to make a bunch of separate fields for each type, or can you use something like a linked agent field that has 2 elements as part of it? You need to look at what the default fields are in the system you're migrating into. Like in our Born Digital theme, we require resource type and model, because that determines how the object is going to display on the front end. So you need to think about, does your data have that? Do you have something already that you can just put into that field, or do you need to add that as new data? And then think about whether you'll be sharing your metadata, like OAI, PMH, DPLA, things like that. Because then you'll need to map that to, especially if it's OAI, PMH, you'll need to map it to from Drupal to DC fields. So once you've thought about this, it's helpful to create a master field list. And we, at Born Digital, we do that in a spreadsheet. We make a CSV template, and I have a couple of examples here. So this is one that we set up for a multilingual site, and I had set this up for a client to use going forward. So I have the required fields in red, and then I have a notes row here about, you know, what these fields are, which is helpful, especially if you're going to be combining fields that you dumped out into one. And I have here the machine name in Drupal, which is what Workbench uses to migrate the data into the field. And then I have some examples here. So going across, we had, I don't know if this one has some custom fields that we added, but let me show you the other example, which is actually from our work with SAIC, which had a lot of fields. We ended up with over 200 Drupal fields. So this is one where we combined fields that were exported. We combined them into one. So we also used some Solar data to determine whether an object had a JP2 or some other type of media. So that was what these columns were. And then if it did, we created a URL for that media and pulled it right from the i7 site during ingest. So we have some extra fields here that weren't getting ingested as object data. And then these are another example. We dumped out a lot of RELZX data just so that we could figure out the relationships from for compound and paged objects. But every Drupal field has a column. We had a couple of custom fields we set up, and so those are sort of highlighted here. And for this, they wanted, instead of using linked agent with all the roles and all the vocabularies available there, we set up a custom typed relation field with just 2 vocabularies, person and corporate body, and just 2 roles that could be used. So this is an example of a large template. So it might be helpful to check out, so you can see those from the slides.
And just to give some context to that last 200 metadata field, because it connects to some of what Dara was mentioning, in that case, there were a lot of fields that we were creating specifically because we were mapping one of our collections to WorldCat, and we needed a way to be able to, in WorldCat's very stupid digital gateway system, we wanted to be able to map certain name fields and others directly to some fields there. But then we were also using ETD metadata, costume core metadata, and had one collection that was 70% bespoke metadata. So sometimes you can go crazy. And this is a screenshot of part of the spreadsheet that I use at Discovery Garden for working with the clients and mapping their metadata. It again starts with the default fields that we use. And then I use this to keep track of a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about in the rest of the procedure. You know, is this a new field? Do we need to change the values in the field? Is it repeated, et cetera? What sort of taxonomies it's connecting to? And then I have this document that can be, by hiding columns and so forth, something that, you know, a client can look at and not be confused by things that they don't care about, or I can share it with developers so that they can see the things that they need when setting up the fields. So yeah, I don't link to a copy of it, but that's a good portion just to give you an idea of the sort of thing you can do. Now, Drupal field types.
So when you're looking at your data and you're thinking about what type of field you need, which is important to do at the beginning because you can't change the field type after there's data in the field. The most commonly used Drupal field types, at least in the projects I've been working on, text, either plain or formatted, regular length or long, entity reference, which generally refers to a taxonomy, typed relation, which can refer to a taxonomy and another set of data like relators or roles, geolocation, which can be text or geographic coordinates, EDTF, which is the date and time, and then a link field. So when you're thinking about whether you need a text field or an entity reference field, think about whether the data should be text or it should be a taxonomy. Will the field contain a lot of content? Do you need a large field or just a small, you know, maybe it's like one sentence? Do you need to enable formatting like bold or italics? So those two questions will determine what kind of text field you need. If you need a vocabulary, if it's something that you want to be able to filter on, you want people to be able, you want to use it as a facet on your search results page, then you would use an entity reference or typed relation field. And if you're doing that, do you need a controlled vocabulary? Do you need to facet on the field? Do you need to map roles to the field? Then you would use a typed relation. Fields can map to more than one vocabulary. So like in Islandora, the subject field maps to several different vocabularies: corporate body, person, subject. And if you need custom vocabularies set up, which is very easy to do in Drupal, you just need to make sure they're set up in Drupal before you migrate. But once they're set up, you can, if you're using Workbench, you can create, it'll create terms on the fly. So that's nice.
Another thing to think about when you're deciding what fields you want to go to is how granular you want your metadata to be. Yeah, in the SIC example we were just talking about a second or so ago, we had to go a little bit more granular with the creator fields so that there would be one that was a primary creator or one field that was just for donors. The example here that I talk about is the subject field. Because in Islandora defaults, there's about 5 fields that describe subject based on the mods subject elements, of which there are about 10. Forgive me. There we go. So with Islandora defaults, you know, we describe basic subject and geographic, and so forth, but there's not like a specific title subject field, if that is something you're interested in, or genre subject field, or things like hierarchical geographic, isn't necessarily represented there. So are there aspects of subject that you want to have in your new system? Then you would need to create some more subject fields, if you want separate ones for each type, excuse me. Again, the multiple taxonomies like Dara was mentioning, and then how you want to manage those taxonomies. If it's a set list that you are always working with, or if you're going to be creating terms on the fly. And I'll talk a little bit more about this. One of the things that Discovery Garden does is we have a way of reproducing the structure of hierarchical geographic subject headings, which have elements, separate elements for city or continent or city section, as well as faceted subjects with a few different subject genre, et cetera, fields using Drupal paragraphs that I'll talk a little bit about in a few minutes. It's not something that's part of Drupal core. We use them. I believe there's some other institutions that have been working with paragraphs in order to reproduce some functionalities. Geolocation. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the separate fields right now. So this is, again, it's a basic field that is primarily used for storing things like latitude and longitude. But if you set up a field as a geolocation field in Drupal, it's not just a string of numbers. It is something that then Drupal can use through views or widgets, et cetera, to present that information in a variety of ways based on modules that you might be using, so that you can present the data in a Google map or some other way that you wouldn't be able to if it was just a series of numbers. There is a coordinates field in Islandora default that is geolocation. This spreadsheet or table, this is a table, talks about basically the formatting of EDTF. Almost everything is there, letting you show things like approximate, letting you show things like season or quarterly, through addition to the basic ISO 89 formatting for a date or a time, using things like tilde or question marks or slashes. It's one of those things you need to keep in mind, because by default, all the date fields are like this, and your date information is not necessarily like this. If you have been using standards in the past, like ISO 89 or W3C15, then there's a good chance, if you've been following those standards, that your data will adapt to the EDTF, that the basic stuff, it just isn't taking advantage of approximate, et cetera. But if you are doing things like having a text field that spells out spring quarter 2016 or spring break issue of the student newspaper, et cetera, you're going to have to make a decision. Is that sort of data something you want to keep? At SAIC, we ended up having one field that was EDTF formatted for sorting purposes, and then the other fields were just reproducing whatever the date was on the object. So taking advantage for sorting, but also continuing to have whatever the date is. So one more thing to keep in mind when you're looking at your fields and looking at your data.
There are also link fields in Drupal, and those can include a label. So you can have some other text that the user sees on the front end that's not the URL. Or it can just be the URL, whichever you'd like. And I just noted here that external links won't by default open in a new browser tab. So that just requires a little additional development. So that's something to keep in mind. To you, Chris.
Yes, we didn't necessarily balance switching back and forth, but one of the other things that we were talking about, decisions that you need to make before you start migrating data, that in Islandora 7 you could make on the fly at any point, are things like, is this field repeatable or not repeatable? Once there is data in a field, you cannot change it from limited to unlimited or back again. You have to decide that in advance. I talk a little bit about, we're not showing a live sandbox right now, but basically when you're creating a field, you can go into the field settings for that field, and there is the allowed number of values, which has two choices: limited, which means you can have that field appear once, or unlimited, which it can be repeated as many times as you want. So you need to look at your data and really see, am I repeating fields that I didn't think I was repeating? Is that data important, or should this really just be a single instance? Okay, and then to talk a little bit about paragraphs. Paragraphs, I'm going to use the wrong word, so my colleagues in the room, please don't nod your head disapprovingly at me. But paragraphs are another type of Drupal node that can have metadata that can connect to the main repository item content type, so that you can do things like having a field in your metadata that is actually represented by multiple fields. So in the example I have right here, related item, that's a chunk of XML that has a parent element and then several subchildren. If you wanted to reproduce the structure of that, you could use it by creating a paragraph like we have for related item. That paragraph then has fields for the type of relationship, the title, URL, extent, various other fields that might go in related item. Then that is then represented by a single related item field in the content type that connects the two for presentation, for editing, and so forth. Just to see, this can be used in a variety of ways. We use it as a title paragraph, so that we can, instead of having separate alternate title, uniform title fields, there's a single title field with the title, and then choosing from a vocabulary what the title type is. Do the same thing with notes and note types. Related item I was just showing. And then at the bottom of this screen, you can see the display for faceted subject and hierarchical geographic subjects. So it's grouping those terms together for presentation purposes. The way they are right now, it's still just a way of displaying and storing data. It does not mean you can click on United States, Illinois, Chicago, Lincoln Square, and it only finds that specific string, but that's something that could be potentially possible with other things.
So besides figuring out what type of field you want to use for your data, there's other things to think about when you're thinking about how your objects are going to look on the site. So what type of objects do you have? Are they, should they be compound? Should you show them as a compound? Should you show them as paged content? Are they images? Are they sound? What type of display needs do you have around media? Do you want a viewer? Do you not want a viewer if you have an image that's lower resolution, for example? And for paged objects, there are a couple different ways to display them. You can, like I said, you could have them be a compound object with the main object that you're viewing at the top and then thumbnails across the bottom. You could have them be a paged object where one view in the viewer, it sort of compiles all of the pages together and you see the pages across the bottom of the viewer and you can scroll through. Or you can just, if you have, maybe you have a lot of TIFFs and you want to combine them into one PDF and just as part of your migration and just display it as a single PDF object. So there's several different ways you can go. And sometimes it's helpful to ingest one and do it, display it one way, take a look. And then, if you don't like it, ingested as a different type of object. So you want to kind of figure that out before you do your wholesale migration in. And then also it's important to think about what kinds of access restrictions you have on objects. Are there certain ones that should only be shown to people on campus or people who are logged in? In the Born Digital install, we use Islandora access vocabulary terms to control that. So that's something you would put into your metadata before you do the ingest. You would figure out which term applies to the object and you just add that in your CSV, or if you're migrating with Workbench. And you also want to think about what types of objects you have in your collection, and are they represented by the default Islandora model and resource type terms. So I put the defaults here. They cover a lot of things, but sometimes you find something. I just recently had someone who has web archive files and it didn't really fit into any of these. So sometimes you have to, and you can add terms if they're not there, but you have to do a little work sometimes in addition to that with contexts and views and displays to make sure things will show up correctly. So the media displays that are available in Islandora by default, we have OpenSeaDragon viewer is used for images, PDF.js viewer is used for PDFs, and there isn't any IA book reader functionality, which would be familiar to people in i7 right now, that has some nice things like, the ability to search within text and navigate right to the page in a book where the term shows up. Mirador is sort of there. It's in development. I know a lot of people are working on it and have some institutions have done some work with it, and I think it's coming, but it's not really ready yet. So that's another thing to think about. If you rely heavily on the IA book reader right now in i7, you kind of want to think about what you can do in the meantime to maintain some of that functionality. Like if you have PDFs and the people can go, if you set your search results to display pages, then at least you can return a page in the search results, and then at least the person can go to that page and then they can search in the PDF.js viewer for the term. It's a little bit clunky, but those are things to think about as you migrate. And I talked a little about this already, the different options for paged objects. If you have individual image files for your paged objects right now, you can do a compound, you could do paged, and I kind of show here the differences between how they look. And then the access restrictions. There are options for if you only want to show media to logged in users or to certain types of users, you can do that. Or if you only want to allow downloading of the media to logged in users, you can have tiered access that some things are available, like everything's available to the admin users and slightly less available as you go down to anonymous users. The IP restricted access is not there by default, but there is a Drupal module that can be used for that.
So briefly talking about metadata cleanup, like I mentioned earlier, this is one of those things that if you want to take the time, it's important to plan ahead that you are going to have time to do whatever sort of metadata cleanup that you want to do. There are tasks that you have to accomplish in order to migrate, and those will always fall as the priority. And like I mentioned earlier, icing on the cake is what metadata cleanup actually is. And just going to mention a few things right now. Things like prioritizing cleaning up bad XML in your data streams or bad solar fields that, both of those get created through the same sort of functionality. And there could be data that's in there that it's going to get lost because you're not planning for it to be there. There are certain vocabulary terms, taxonomies that you want to clean up in your data before you move things over, things like your relator terms or type of resource or frequency that just have a short number of values. So it's easier to go through and make sure that you're accurate to all of that. And then any metadata that's going to connect to actions in the migration or in the configuration of Islandora 2.0, these are the things that are your priority. And I just list a few actions and resources. OpenRefine is an amazing resource for cleaning up if you're working with spreadsheets, letting you do things like analyze the metadata that's in your fields. When I'm working with directly with the XML files, I have various scripts that let me produce CSV files of one specific XML field and the values that are in it. I'm not trying to reproduce the entire thing in a spreadsheet, but I reproduce a field or two so that I can see how sub-elements are working with a parent and so forth. And if you want to know more about metadata management or metadata cleanup, be sure to attend the metadata management in Islandora session tomorrow, or with Paige and Michelle, or Paige is also doing a talk about her metadata migration at Whitman on Friday, I believe. Yes, that is a head shake. So I'm sure these things and many of the things that we're talking about will be covered differently in those. So just returning to the Foxmel migration that I mentioned earlier, there is a step of cleanup that happens with that is a little different than the way Workbench adds. Like I mentioned, we are pulling the XML straight from the data stream, but there is a step that can happen to normalize the XML before it is brought into the migration script, letting me do things like do some of that vocabulary changes, or making sure that elements are with their parent and so forth. So it does a tiny bit of touching the XML before the import, and then the actual import happens with a YAML script, which matches up the XPaths in the XML files to the specific Drupal fields that they're going to be going into in the Islandora 2.0. Workbench.
So when you are preparing your metadata in the spreadsheet for Workbench, you want to ensure that all the data for the typed relation and multi-taxonomy fields has a prefix, which specifies which vocabulary they're going to go into, like person, colon, corporate body, colon. Or for typed relation fields, you want to also add the role, so relators, colon, and then whatever the abbreviation of the role is. So here I have the example of CRE for creator, and then the person for the taxonomy, and then you would have the name. And then you want to think about the collection structure. What are your top level collections? Do you have sub collections? And I've found that where possible, if you create the collection nodes in Drupal first, and then you migrate into those by referencing the node ID in Workbench, it just kind of makes things easier and cleaner. And if you have complex taxonomies, if they're hierarchical or if they have an authority URI, like I mentioned earlier, you need to migrate those in through Workbench first. And so that requires a little upfront work to pull those out into a sheet, one per taxonomy. Then you can just leave the terms as they are in your data and just reference them. You don't have to replace them with IDs or anything like that. So we've talked a lot about preparing the data, but then you also have the media and the files. So depending on how you're going to migrate those into Islandora 2.0, there are some different ways you can do it. There are different things to think about. One of them is where are your files currently stored? Are they in an S3 bucket? Can you easily access them? Do you have to pay to access them and get them out? And where are you going to store them in Islandora 2.0? There are a couple different options for accessing and pulling the files during your migration. You can pull them directly from an AWS S3 bucket, but this Workbench, if you're using Workbench, it requires that to be a fully open bucket during the migration, fully open to the public. So that's one thing to think about there. You can also pull the OBJ data streams directly from the i7 site through Workbench by just referencing the URL of the data stream in the file column in your worksheet. But there are a couple caveats to that. One is there can be issues with JP2s as source files. So if you have a lot of OBJs that are JP2s, they will silently be erroneous. You will not know till you try to look at the object and the player. There's an issue with OpenSeaDragon and some JP2s, and it just won't show them, but the file looks fine. So yeah, it's something we spent some time on that with SAIC. And then it does also require some manipulation in your migration CSVs and just pulling some extra Solr data to figure out which objects have an OBJ, which objects have a JP2, and generating those. You can generate the URLs, the paths to those files automatically, but it requires a little bit of extra attention. And then some other things to think about around the media. Do you want to migrate your derivatives? Like if you have OCR files that you've edited, maybe they're clean and nice and you want to move those over too. Otherwise, they can be regenerated during the migration when you migrate through Workbench. And then will you be storing the master files in Fedora? Or are you keeping those somewhere else? So do you only want to migrate the derivatives or smaller versions of your source files?
Get to you've made all these decisions, and then we get to the part where you're actually needing to configure Drupal on the new Islandora site. So we're going to briefly touch on how we're setting up the new fields and new taxonomies, or potentially updating the defaults that are already there. So this is a basic breakdown of the steps for creating a new field. You're adding it to the repository item content type. You select the field type that we've been discussing, whether it's text or EDTF, et cetera. That is, the steps in orange are the ones that cannot be changed after you start to bring data into your collection. So the field type cannot be changed. Make that decision ahead of time, or be prepared to delete and create a new field. You add the label for a field. This is something that you can change at other times. So if you decide that abstract would look better displayed as a description, great, you can do that after the migration. The machine name that is created for that specific field within Drupal is something that is automatically created when you create a field, but you can edit it if you want to at that step. Once the field's been created, you can no longer edit that. There are settings to describe the maximum length of a text field, or the type of item that you're going to be referencing, taxonomies, et cetera. The allowed number of values is one of those things that cannot change, which we talked about earlier, limited or unlimited. And then when you're creating a field, or later, you can set the visibility and permissions of that field, certain user types, et cetera, who can or cannot see the field when the metadata is displayed. And then if you're creating an entity reference, this is where you can assign what vocabularies it is connecting to. This is also where you would set an option if you wanted to be able to create new terms in that taxonomy on the fly as you are editing. you set that checkbox in the field, in the settings for managing that field. And that is something that you can change later on. And further, I think we mentioned this earlier, if it is connecting to multiple taxonomies, at this point, in the same space, you would decide which of those taxonomies might get new fields, new terms, when they're being added through the form on the create reference entities if they don't already exist. And then creating a taxonomy is very similar. You were going into structure taxonomy and then adding a vocabulary, give it a title. You can give it a description if you want, or I know some institutions are working with multiple languages, so you can assign a language. And then once the vocabulary is created, you can go through and manage the fields. You can add fields to describe your vocabulary terms, whatever you want. The main one, if you want to record the information about authority sources, is an authority sources field. That's the basic. There is a list that you would then fill in the authorities that you would want that has a basic format key, pipe, label. The format key is what is stored and the label is what is displayed. You can add whatever additional fields. You can just look at the person or organization vocabularies and the defaults to see examples of taxonomies that use a lot of internal fields. And then when you, yes, add term, never mind, continuing on. And then once you have added fields, the other two places to edit are the metadata display and the form display. And these are, again, things that you can adjust at any time. You are presented default, you just drag and drop fields from displayed to not disabled. Rearrange them however you want, decide information on widgets, etc. When you create new fields, they are not suddenly doubting what I was about to say. So I'm not going to say if they're automatically put into displayed or undisplayed. I think they're, yeah, that's what I thought.
The default, I think in the default display they do, but the other displays don't get them.
Gotcha. So yes, you are going to need to go to the specific view modes that you are using for the resource repository item content type and add them where you are wanting. And mentioning the OpenSeaDragon and PDF.js viewer as two of the default views that you're going to want to edit. And then one thing, because this is one of those pieces that it took me a little while to learn. We've talked about all the wonderful formatting that EDTF lets you do, but it is not necessarily set up to display those things in plain text by default. You are given wonderful options in the display options for an EDTF field that let you decide if you want months spelled out or what order the dates should be going. But you need to change them to the settings that I mentioned on here if you wanted to actually say approximate 1972, et cetera. By default, it would just say 1972 tilde. So again, maybe you don't want to spell everything out, but if you do, it's one of those things you need to take a look at. Hi.
That was the end.
And that was the end, yes. We didn't have a big climactic slide, so so yeah, it looks like we are doing very good on time. So if we will open it up for questions now, both on the chat and in the room about anything we've talked about or things that we may not have talked about.
Like 200 different apps.
I have not looked into that.
We did. I think we had thought about that because we were worried that that it would take a long time to load the form when you have that many fields. And we actually, what we ended up doing was collapsing groups of fields into subsets. And so when you load the form, some of those subgroups are collapsed by default. And so it actually doesn't have to show you all the fields every time you open the form. And we did talk about different content types.
Yeah.
But that would require a lot of work to then update our displays and our views and our context to make sure that we were using the other content type too. So it ended up, I think it ended up just being easier and smoother to just keep the one and just try to do what we could to slow down. The one place we do still see an issue is the solar fields page, because it shows all of the index fields and it's like, wait, do you want to wait some more? Chrome's going to time out when you try to open this page, but it eventually loads.
Yeah, with the SAIC, especially since we're talking about all those fields, about 70% of them are specific to 2 collections. There is a very extensive garment collection, which is where we use all these costume core terms to describe those, as well as a lot of unique ones specific to the teachers at SAIC. And then there is an artist book collection, which has a lot of bespoke ones in order to describe the material as it's being taught there. So yeah, it would have been great if then we could present a form that only addressed those. But yeah, it looked like it would be so much work to manage all of that.
And the question, just to repeat it for those on Zoom, was whether we'd considered a different content type because of all the different fields and the separate groups of very custom fields for certain collections.
What are the most important activities?
Okay, so the question was, what are the most important tasks that a client team or group can do to prepare for a migration? Things that we talked about is knowing what you have and knowing what you want. So, taking the time to look at your current collection and decide these are the things that are most important about how I save my data and present my objects in Islandora 7. And these are the things that I want some way of reproducing in the new Islandora 2.0 site. And then really looking at Islandora 2.0, looking at sites that have already migrated or looking underneath the hood so that you can understand what is possible with Islandora 2.0. So you can see those things that will, reproduce your special items or that you can take advantage of that just weren't possible in Islandora 7.
And I think one thing that we do is we ask people to come up with a representative sample of your metadata so that we can use that and ingest that upfront to give you a sense of what your objects as a whole are going to look like. So I think if you can pull something like that together, even for if you're working internally, just to have that sort of representative sample to work with would be a really good idea, because I think that would also help you know what you have and how you want it to look, like Chris was saying. Okay, so there's a question about the complex taxonomies. Taxonomies that are hierarchical or have authority URIs require a separate migration step. Yes, so you need to create a separate CSV that has, it's one per taxonomy, and then each row is a term. And then you'd have probably, there's usually about 3 columns that go into that depending on what you're ingesting. But one of the columns would be, if it was hierarchical, one column would be for the parent of that term. If you had an authority URI, there you'd have 2 columns. One is for the URI and one is for the authority. And so you'd basically treat it like you are ingesting objects, but it's with taxonomy terms. And there's a separate YAML file that you would use for that, for Workbench. And Mark has some really good documentation on the Workbench, with the Workbench documentation about specifically what you need to put in the CSV in terms of columns, and then also what you need to put in the YAML file.
One question asking about any links to sites that have already migrated to 2.0. I actually have a list for a presentation I'd had to do a short while ago, so I'll add a slide. I know some are already showing up in the Slack, but I'll make sure to add a slide to the presentation, and I'll include a few there, and then Dara can add any that she wants to share as well. So we'll get that stuff to folks.
I see there was a question about migrating Excel sheets. I think if you take a look at in the slideshow, there's links to 2 example CSV templates that I put in there that might be helpful. They have a lot of notes in them about what each column is and why it's there. That might be a good place to start.
Questions in the room? Yes. Statement. The statement was remarking about the spreadsheet I shared about metadata mapping. Every time I use that, I add at least 1 column. So it's so easy to fall down the Google Sheets or Excel hole and try to map your entire brain into a single spreadsheet.
Or are you avoiding that section of IslandoraCon?
I believe we are currently avoiding RDF. The question was about using paragraphs and then the difficulty in mapping them to RDF. And I avoided the question for now, but it is, yeah. Okay.
That actually brings up another good point about RDF is if you're adding a custom field, you're also going to have to, if you want that in RDF, you have to map that to an RDF field, but there's not a way to do it in the Drupal UI. So you need to actually do it in a YAML file. So it's a little, I have not personally done it yet.